You're playing like a bullshit game right now.
I'm not playing a game right now. I'm asking you what your source is for that. What are the names that you're talking about?
Everybody knows that there were individuals who were identified as talking in confidential conversations with diplomats and US
I don't know what you're talking about because I don't know what your source is.
Sorry. All right. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for your walk down nonsense lane.
Hi, I'm Matthew Feeney from ReasonTV, here to discuss the Bradley Manning trial. I am joined by Eli Lake, national security correspondent for the Daily Beast and Newsweek, Adam Klasfeld from Courthouse News, and Alexa O'Brien, an independent journalist covering the Bradley Manning trial. Alexa, I'd like to begin with you. Why should we care about the Bradley Manning trial?
The Bradley Manning trial is a historic case. It is the largest criminal investigation ever into a publisher and its source. It has wide ramifications on the First Amendment. There are charges in the Bradley Manning trial that have never been used in military law. They're not tied to any kind of federal or punitive article under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. One of them is wanton publication. The fact that this young soldier has been charged with aiding the enemy for essentially leaking information to a media organization is also a cause for grave concern amongst the press.
Eli, do you think it's as significant as Alexa does?
I think it's a significant case because of the unprecedented wholesale leak that Bradley Manning enabled. It changed, I think, the way that we look at the war on terror. It changed how a lot of people in countries like Tunisia regarded their government. And it confirmed a lot of things that were kind of in the sort of, everybody sort of nodded and knew about them. But, we had evidence that, the president of Yemen, for example, was, lying to his own Congress, lying to his own parliament about American drone strikes in his country. And this case is significant because I don't think the military I think the military in a lot of ways never kind of envisioned that they would ever have to prosecute something like this.
And Adam, when was if it really is as unprecedented as Eli and Alexa mentioned, can you give us a bit of a background of these sort of aiding the enemy cases and when the last time someone like this was prosecuted?
Well, the last time that the aiding the enemy charge has been used for a leak to the press was the Civil War era. The case of Private Henry Vanderwater, who leaked a Union roster to a newspaper in Alexandria, Virginia. That seems like quite a different matter altogether or fact record than what's happening in this case.
What do you think, Alexa, about the aiding the enemy charge? What enemy was actually aided in this case?
Well, according to the Bill of Particulars, there are two enemies, Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula. There was a classified enemy that we only knew as Bates number such and such to Bates number such and such, but that actually was withdrawn by the prosecution right before they closed their case.
Sure, but do you think it qualifies as aiding the enemy?
It's a little bit of a complicated story, but I think Julian Assange at one point did try to work with the U.S. government to redact elements of it. The U.S. government rejected that offer. A version of WikiLeaks was published with actual names of individuals who had confidential conversations with U.S. diplomats. That is something akin to publishing the kind of confidential informant list of a police department. And so even if you didn't give it directly to the mafia or you didn't give it directly to the criminal element, they can read it just like everybody else. And in that sense, we know that there were enormous efforts to try to get certain people out of harm's way. There were public statements from some groups, particularly in Lebanon, of people who would talk to various diplomats. And it caused a lot of problems, I think, to people who wanted to help the United States in dangerous places. That said, it also disclosed lots of things I think the American people had a right to know about the nature of the war and the nature of these relationships, and it disclosed lots of things that people of Tunisia and Yemen and Egypt should know about their own government.
Disclosure of those names, I mean, it's been said that none of them have come into harm's way. I think that's one way. It's an important fact for understanding the case.
I mean, I'm
somewhat
skeptical of that.
There's a point of fact that's actually factually not true. If you look at what WikiLeaks released vis-a-vis the media partners, especially with regards to Cablegate, it was the most controlled release of the Manning documents. And WikiLeaks didn't release anything that wasn't similarly released by their media partners with regards to Cablegate. In terms of the persons at risk group, that was disbanded within months. Formally. It was formally meeting, and then within months it stopped formally meeting and met informally. In terms of the evidence presented in discovery and and this portion will come up in the sentencing, but there are 3 classified damage assessments. One of them is the State Department, and there is no harm, no actual harm.
I don't buy it.
Why don't you buy the fact
you've
that
never been
Because
in a courtroom.
I saw the cables myself. These intelligence reports. They say so-and-so living in such a town, met with the military, and there were other tranches besides Cablegate. When you name those people, if you cover a
1 million
war,
people had access to Cablegate on the SIPTIS system. There was no password protection on SIPTIS.
Okay.
It is
How is
like
that
very
relevant?
It's very low-level intelligence. It doesn't contain human in it.
there are cables of people in places like Azerbaijan meeting with U.S. diplomats talking about illicit Iranian activities
I'm talking
that
about
made
the
it
facts
into
of
the
the case
SIPRNet.
as presented in the trial, not a speculative analysis from away from the courtroom.
I'm not telling you a speculative analysis. I have eyes to read. I read the cables. I know. I cover wars. I cover these people a lot. When you put somebody out there in a confidential meeting in a situation in a country like Azerbaijan, Lebanon, Afghanistan, what have you, and when you do that, you are putting that person at risk, which is why the State Department and other elements of the U.S. government had to, in some cases, actually get people out of harm's way. So what you can say whatever you want, it's not as clear a cut case. And I acknowledge that there was public benefit to a lot of these things as well. But to sit here and just say that there was no impact or whatsoever, there's a reason why those things are.
It's from the court
record. It doesn't matter.
I
don't know how.
What I'm stating, Eli, isn't just simply my opinion on it, which is what you're stating.
No, I'm not stating my opinion.
I'm stating what's coming out of the court record, which is actually considered to be fact in terms of the process of reasoning whether or not there was harm or not.
I don't know why the prosecution decided to present facts as they did or not present facts as they did. I'm also presenting you facts. There were lots of efforts by the U.S. government to get people out of harm's way. There were terrorist groups that announced that they were going to be going through these to find who informers were. And I've talked to people who, so you can say whatever you want. I'm saying when you have that massive a data dump, it's not always going to be, roses and flowers.
I'll tell you one thing about this in terms of the term data dump as well. Manning is a product of the information age. He grew up with social media. He grew up with an accessibility to information with Google. I mean, he's very much a child of that generation. So to look at his leaks, one has to also understand that they're completely proportional to the information age. And as Yochai Benkler testified in court last week with regards to large data dumps, which is what the prosecution said. Yochai Benkler talked about the fact that insight can be gleaned from these large data sets, that they provide beyond just simply confirmation and revelation of a small set of documents. They actually provide insight that you couldn't glean.
Let me just talk about a kind of unrelated, what could have been called a data dump, but was not performed by WikiLeaks. The Federal PACER database, when it first came into existence, and this is an underexplored parallel, I think. When it first came into existence, there sprang up a website called Who's a Rat? And because, and that website came into existence because the names of government sources became exposed in a completely vetted and official database. It's a database that every US journalist used and is thankful for its existence. Had the very same issues of does the benefit of enriching the public record outweigh the potential risks of disclosure? Now, that's not a free pass.
Well, we have in our court system, when someone rats in a criminal case,
sure.
we there are classified courtrooms, but for the most part, they testify in open court, putting all their names. So they are aware of the risk to a certain extent when they testify in court. When an informant talks to somebody in the U.S. Embassy, or in the Iraq War, Afghanistan War, town elder meets with a U.S. intelligence analyst, or something like that, there is an expectation. In fact, there's a great expectation. I know because I deal with confidential sources that their names will not appear in public.
Oh, absolutely.
When those names did appear in public, it caused damage to those individuals. Now,
well, see,
period. Finish the end.
No. Well, what it caused is potential damage. I mean, we have.
Why are you guys splitting hairs?
No. Well, I mean,
what do you think people are going to do with that?
Because I think you're being actually very vague and sloppy about it. I mean, this is a very serious trial. In many cases, it's historic. It's almost like the Scopes trial, because we're talking about a generational shift in terms of who has the right to information.
I'm not doubting it is an important trial.
I also want to ask each of you, I suppose, if in the age of the internet, if the argument's going to be, well, terrorists could have accessed this information, doesn't that Isn't that a sort of weak standard to set, considering that?
No, it's not. And I'm sorry. I have very little patience for. You're talking about relationships and conversations that the person expects anonymity and confidentiality on. When you rip that away, whether you did it for good reasons or bad reasons, and whether that results in the murder of the individual or just that individual having to change his phone number or whatever, I think that you have to count that as part of the harm. Now, I'm not one of these people that says that that's the reason Bradley Manning is a bad person. I think it's a very complicated case, and in the end, I think he should get leniency, because I think in the end, this is a product of excessive secrecy from the government, having these excessive relationships. When you expose that information, we know more about what our government's doing, we know more about the actual war. And so I think that there's a lot of public benefit as well. So I'm trying to but I never have been persuaded that you could say that there was no harm, or that, it hasn't been proven. And I don't quite understand why Bradley Manning's defenders have tried to sort of stick to this case as if none of this is a big deal. Have you ever covered in a war zone? Did you ever know what it's like to get that kind of information?
I'll tell you one
And when you
thing.
get someone to trust you, and then to have that trust ripped away.
The fact of the matter is that the cables were marked SIPTUS, which means they were widely distributed amongst U.S. government employees and federal contractors, firstly. And in terms of
that's still not
Bradley Manning's supporters,
It's not public.
I'm talking, that's a sort of assumption that you're making. I'm talking about the facts in the case as presented in the court record, and I'm relaying those facts. Now, if we want to talk about misinformation and we want to talk about speculation, we can talk about U.S. government statements that Manning was harming other people, that Manning that his leaks were a threat to national security and not merely embarrassing. The rhetoric coming out of the White House, calling him guilty before trial, calling WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning criminals. All of the different aspects of the interagency process that were honed in on WikiLeaks as well as the accused, Bradley Manning, I think is an even more important story than speculative or hypothetical harm to people that was drummed up in the press and led to people calling for his execution. That, to me, seems completely unreasonable and I think also a bit unjust.
One thing that I would say...
Thank you for your adjectives.
Well, no. One thing I would say is, from any side of this, it should be grounded in fact. And I mean, to say conclusively that harm occurred when we aren't there yet, and we have a large body of evidence saying that the harm was not anywhere near as cracked up to be. I think rather than having these kind of conclusory, no harm occurred, harm occurred, I think that we need to wait for the facts to come in. This case has always been about, are the risks of disclosure outweighed by the...
Well, I agree with that. I agree it's not an either or. I think it's somewhat of a muddy case. I just think that...
And more, this case is also about transparency and about whether or not this individual can get a fair trial. What is actually happening in the courtroom? So many people make commentary on this case and they are not privy, not through no fault of their own, because there was no public docket. So many people are misinformed about the actualities in the courtroom that I think are really actually more informative to public debate about the value of these disclosures and where we are as a nation, what age we live in, and where those boundaries are between, as you had asked earlier, state secrecy and the First Amendment.
Well, so just a quick question, but you presumably do believe that there is a line that the state does have the right to some secrets. What do you think that line should be, and what should the punishment be for crossing it by disclosing classified information?
Well, to answer your first question about where that line should be, I think that when we oftentimes talk about this question, the line is already assumed to be the national security state and the intelligence sector. But for me, state secrecy includes unlimited private donations to candidates. I think that's the kind of state secrecy that's also very dangerous, in addition to national security, because what it does is it essentially erodes the fundamental checks and balances that create just and stable governance. Now, clearly, governments and states need to have secrets. Chase Madar talks about the fact that if you look at how much the U.S. classifies in a year, it's essentially, what Manning leaked was 1% of what the U.S. government classifies in a year. If the U.S. government actually classified...
I'd be surprised if it was that high.
If the U.S. government actually classified less, and really kept a hold of what was genuinely top secret or secret, and what was genuinely just simply, the mistake of a original classification authority, I think they'd have a better time handling that information in the information age.
You were asking the limits of acceptable limits of state secrecy, and it's really interesting. I mean, really mundane answer would be, I think it's pretty well outlined in several executive orders what's something we could agree upon: the vulnerabilities of systems, intelligence sources and methods. These are fairly non-controversial things.
Well, if you think sources and methods are a problem, then when you have sources revealed in these cables,
there aren't any sources and methods in SIPTIS cables.
Well, I'm saying literally human sources were in the intelligence database, and they were named and identified, and there were also in Cablegate.
What's your source for that?
The frickin' documents. I remember writing about it.
So you're viewing the documents and you see the sources in it. So this is your opinion on whether or not there are sources and methods in there.
Alexa, I have no idea really what you're saying right now.
I know you're
passionate about it.
No, what's your source?
Because it names the guy who met with the other guy.
Who guy? Which guy? Who are you talking about?
I don't have it in front of me right now. I read about this like 3 years ago. Okay. I'm telling you, and it was widely cited.
If you
can
answer
find
a
the
question about what your source is, how am I supposed to value whether or not you actually...
Because it's in the documents. You're playing like a bullshit game right now.
I'm not playing a game right now. I'm asking you what your source is for that. What are the names that you're talking about?
Everybody knows that there were individuals who were identified as talking in confidential conversations with diplomats and
I don't know what you're talking about because I don't know what your source is.
Sorry. All right. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for your walk down nonsense lane.
Well,
I think actually you're nonsense because you don't have a source.
Well,
all right. Okay.
To bring it to, I think, something where we can kind of get a more productive discussion out of this is, okay.
We should say also,
Alexa,
we
are
should
you
say
saying that none of the documents that were leaked by Lake, are you saying none of the documents leaked by Lake named individuals who had confidential conversations with U.S. officials? You're saying you have no evidence of that.
Okay, first
is that what you're saying?
Let me finish my sentence, okay? I am not on the Jerry Springer show. First of all, there is actually public reporting that people who were contacted by the State Department, who were thought to be on these persons at risk group, this matrix that they made up, who were like, you know what, I don't even know why you're calling me. In terms of whether or not there were named sources, clearly there was a mitigation team and that they handled whatever it is that they needed to handle. The reality of it, and the original question that you asked, is was there any actual harm? And that there wasn't. I mean, from the pretrial record, there wasn't.
Well, let me just in plain English, because I mean, in an odd way, I find myself often arguing how the benefits of WikiLeaks. You have a basic harm that when governments even have confidential diplomatic conversations with people, such as Mayor Dagon, discussing what the Israeli strategy for stopping the Iranian nuclear program with Nick Burns is one cable I remember writing about. There's an expectation from these governments that these conversations would not be public because people are going to say things in private. Now, does that mean that therefore it shouldn't have been declassified? I think it's a case-by-case issue. But I think there's clearly harm in that everybody says this now. The U.S. does not have the same level of trust that it can hold secrets the way that it did before. So people are not, so that limits in some ways diplomacy.
To jump off that point.
It harms us diplomatically.
There was not a very exotic hacking tool that Bradley Manning used to get this data. He downloaded a piece of freeware and he had unprecedented access. I've spoken to diplomats who, one diplomat told me she read more cables, and this is a diplomat who has served decades in the Foreign Service. She read more cables from the WikiLeaks disclosure than she had in her entire career. And this is from a 22-year-old at the time intelligence specialist.
We should say this.
But you accept that for diplomacy to function in a good way, that diplomats need to be able to communicate with one another with assumed confidentiality. Would you agree that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a space for allowing people to be, open about their thoughts before coming to any kind of conclusion. I mean, I think that's absolutely, completely appropriate.
So do you think it's a worthwhile argument to make that Eli was hinting at earlier, that if you harm the United States' ability to conduct diplomacy, that harm's been done?
Well, listen, let's talk about who is the actor who should be attributed the responsibility. Firstly, if we look at the public reporting, the government's own studies of overclassification, even properly trained classification authorities misclassify. Do you remember the percentage points?
Something north of 60%.
Yeah, 64%, I think, is what it is. The other issue here is, in terms of public diplomacy, is within this database, the CIPTIS database, it should not have contained anything that would have caused any kind of great, damage to bilateral relationships.
But even
I gotta say, okay, so one, I agree. We have way too many secrets. There's huge parts of the government that are secrets, and I'm against it. And I like unauthorized disclosures and leaks, and I don't like the crackdown on leakers. And I'm very much on the libertarian side of it, as I've written plenty of times, even for this publication. So I'm generally very sympathetic to all those arguments. But getting into the percentage of stuff, you have to go look at the contents of it. These cables disclosed things that were incredibly damaging to specific relationships. And in that respect, you have to ask yourself, well, maybe it's worth it. I'm of the view that it's kind of extraordinary that the president of Yemen can allow the United States to conduct drone warfare in his country and lie about it to his own fake parliament, okay? Mm-hmm. But the reality is, if you talk to people who did diplomacy in Yemen, that's the only way they could be allowed to do it, because of the peculiarities of Yemen in this period. So I'm not saying that I think in the end it probably is good that we know exactly the true nature of these relationships, okay? Or for example, that the king of Saudi Arabia, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia rather, said that Iran was a snake and you had to cut off the head and so forth. But that also kind of causes harm to our ally in Saudi Arabia, because and there have been some people. I'm just saying.
I want to respond to this with 2 points. The first is Abdullah Shahi was recently released from prison, and the WikiLeaks release showed that essentially he was reporting the fact that U.S. was cluster bombing in Yemen. Here is a journalist speaking about the First Amendment, a Yemeni journalist who Obama specifically requested he be kept in prison, even after Amnesty International, after the WikiLeaks release, called for his release because clearly he was printing the truth. I'll even go back. Reuters reported in January 2011 that State Department officials were playing up harm. They were playing up harm in front of Congress in order to bolster a prosecution of not only Julian Assange, but also of WikiLeaks. And so clearly there is this overhyped rhetoric. And one of the values of having a trial is we get to see what are the facts. What is actually happening? Because without the truth, we can't really make proper judgments about what we should do, what's appropriate, and what isn't appropriate.
Well, let me just go back. I just want to ask you a question. I mean, you were talking about the Yemeni cable as an example of harm. Do you believe that was one that shouldn't become public? Because
I
that
told
was
you, I think that there was value in exposing the hypocrisy of the president of Yemen.
Sure.
But the world is a little bit more complicated. And if you believed that you needed to have the secrecy in order to conduct this action in Yemen, and the only one who was allowed to know about it is the head of the Yemeni security services and the president of Yemen and a few people there, okay? And everything else was going to be hushed up, and they were going to lie to their own public, and we were going to lie to our public. Now, I'm for sunshine. I think it's good that we know the facts. I'm glad we know that.
My question is specifically regarding this cable. Where does the balance tip for you?
But it's not about. I'm not a policymaker. I'm a journalist. I'm just saying that if you don't recognize that there is a downside, I suppose, to the relationship, and the government can define as harm.
Who said they don't recognize there's a downside?
Well,
or there isn't impact in a bilateral
relationship. That's the only point I'm trying to make.
That's a point that I've accepted.
Okay, fine.
That's.
I think, as I said, I would agree. I'm glad that we know the truth about that, and I think it makes us more informed. And I think that the U.S. should. I think all the secrecy is often bad.
That grounds it to a very more productive discussion. Where does the line exist and where should it exist? I interviewed 4 retired Foreign Service officers and talked to them broadly about the concept of open diplomacy, and that was what Manning professed when he leaked the data in the internet chats. He said that he was inspired by Woodrow Wilson's open diplomacy ideals. Now, I asked diplomats about that, and fully expecting that they'd say, "Oh, you can't do that with cables. Don't be absurd." And what I found was very diverse answers. Some people felt that cables should not be released under any circumstances, and some said this is how an official database could work. This is how the government could actually get behind a public repository of cables. So I think once we ground the discussion into the nitty-gritty of it, if that's the case, when can it be released? What can be released? Then we can have then we can move forward.
I would just be interested to hear all the participants' opinions on Bradley Manning's future. The trial is still ongoing, sentencing is still to happen. Eli, earlier you mentioned that you think he deserves some leniency. What do you think would be an appropriate punishment for what Bradley Manning, if he's found
I'm
guilty
uncomfortable kind of getting into that as a journalist. I don't think he should be put away for the rest of his life. But that said, both eyes are open, and I think that there are instances of harm that we've kind of discussed earlier as well. And I think, as you pointed out, Alexa, he acknowledged that he acknowledged that harm in his own plea. And I think that that's probably about, where it is at this point.
Please, Adam.
I think part of what brought this trial astray is the decision to treat this rather than a case of civil disobedience and the case of a traitor and a spy. Using the 100-year-old statute, the Espionage Act, originally designed to prosecute pacifists during World War I who were getting in the way of the war effort, or exhuming this 150-year-old interpretation of the aiding the enemy statute to set this very troubling precedent.
Alexa, what do you think the verdict is likely to be, or what the sentences are likely to be, and what do you think separately he deserves?
I think that Judge Lind will, there's a very good possibility she'll find him guilty of aiding the enemy. And I also think that she will find him guilty of some of the greater offenses for the espionage. I think that Bradley Manning will be sentenced for put away for a very, very long time. I don't think that he should get more than a couple of years, maybe even time served.
Either, what are your thoughts?
One of the things that was really eye-opening, I think, is when we learned about how he was treated in the interim. He was on the suicide watch, which was a form of almost, it seemed like torture, psychological torture, where he couldn't sleep. He was in this room and constantly checking him, and kind of for his own good. It was out of Clockwork Orange. That's sort of what it was like. I mean, it was extraordinary to kind of read that.
Despite him staying in an 8x6 cell 23 hours a day or more, the ruling was that there was no solitary confinement. I mean, that's part of the findings of fact. And that says something about how widely the practice of isolation is in America, in American prisons, and that it's not even recognized as such in a case as in this one, where someone is spending at least, if not more than 23 hours a day in an 8x6 foot cell.
We've spoken a little bit about the actual effects of the leaks on American diplomacy and policy, but I suppose I'd be very interested to ask Eli what you think the actual foreign policy implications are, especially in respect to, did this snowball the Arab Spring, or is that exaggerated? What do you think the actual effects have been internationally?
It's hard to say that it's a direct cause and effect, but we do know that, at least in the case of Tunisia, where it started off, a lot of the organizers cited WikiLeaks cables and the corruption specifically of the Ben Ali family as one of the factors that sort of led to this popular outrage. And it is outrageous. And the United States had these kind of, they were imperfect, they were problematic relationships with dictatorships. And those dictatorships relied on secrecy, and we became partners in that kind of secrecy and lying to those public. And we held those secrets, and those secrets were contained in those cables, which is why, despite the designation, they were very significant. That's my point, is that, and like I agree, there's way too much overclassification and stuff. And I would say that Bradley Manning would have done himself, I think, more favors if he, instead of making the sort of determination that I'm going to release things of this classification level, if he would have said these 30 cables show, or if that had happened, and instead of it being, as I said, the kind of wholesale, like everything in this classification was out, then I think it would have been a much cleaner case that he was a whistleblower and an act of civil disobedience.
Well, I agree that it would have been a cleaner case of whistleblowing. I think that it qualifies as civil disobedience either way. Some of his leaks were classic whistleblowing. I mean, the Baghdad airstrike video that WikiLeaks titled Collateral Murder. And there are things that kind of expand upon the concept and take us into our uncharted territory of, is this broad category of data, can we learn more from it? One example that Yochai Bankler used was with the Iraq war logs. The benefit of the mass leak, without the mass leak of that entire SIGAX, the public would not have had the data to contest official casualty counts. You don't get that from smoking gun documents.
But if you think about the fact that Julian Assange, as editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, sent a letter to Harold Koh at the State Department, the legal advisor of the State Department, and asked specifically, is there anything that needs to be pulled from these that is a direct harm to the United States? The fact that the State Department didn't take him up on that offer, so to speak, and work with WikiLeaks to filter out, I think speaks volumes to essentially their irresponsibility if there was in fact something in that disclosure that actually, hypothetically could cause damage. The other thing too is when the State Department was briefing Congress, right when the leaks were coming out, and they had already had 6 months because the Defense Intelligence Agency Information Review Task Force, they knew what was coming out. They knew which documents Manning had. Their review, Gates wrote to Senator Levin, there were essentially no sources and methods in this release. It didn't mean that it wouldn't harm national security, but national security broadly defined, economic interests, political interests, not specifically intelligence assets. The other thing too is when those State Department officials spoke to Congress, an anonymous congressional aide, 2 of them, told Reuters that the State Department played up that damage to bolster their prosecution. So those are all those other factors that need to be put into this discussion around these leaks, because we've had enough of the rhetoric of, hyperbolic rhetoric of, fear, fear, fear. What we need to do as a nation, I think, and as a press, is help the public have an informed discussion about the reality of these leaks.
And we need to ground that discussion in fact. The potential harm caused by the leaks of the Guantanamo detainee profiles. The government has charged, five detainee profiles as representative for the potential harm. Which detainees? We don't know. That's a secret.
But we have a hint of them. And the hint is, and this is based on by public reporting of the defense witness, it looks like it might be the Tipton 3. The UK residents who were released, not charged with anything, and who have subsequently made anti-Guantanamo Bay documentaries. What's interesting is the US government considers them terrorist recidivists because of these documentary films.
What do you think Bradley Manning's demeanor is? How do you think he feels about his potential sentence?
What I've seen is a young man grow up in a courtroom. I mean, when we first saw Bradley Manning, he had very pink skin, he looked very young, and he was very young. And now he's 25 years old, his jaw is sharper. He's a very methodical person on the stand, and he's also very reserved. He only speaks, of course, when spoken to. He's a very earnest character. I mean, his earnestness comes off as very naive when you first hear him. At least that's my impression. But as you continue to listen to him, there's this kind of old-fashioned common sense that comes through that's it's quite endearing.
All 3 of you, I'd like to ask what you think the biggest takeaway from this, the Bradley Manning case is.
You learn a lot more from the trial if you look at it in terms of what we know about the way our social institutions function. We should be having a discussion about open diplomacy. We should be having discussions about the contents of the leaks to a much higher extent.
Eli, your thoughts?
We have too many secrets. The secret bureaucracy is way too big. We should probably demand a lot more transparency, and we should have a serious discussion about what are the secrets that are worth protecting. And then we have to ask ourselves, is this country as a superpower capable of having diplomatic relations and having allies that rely on massive secrecy themselves from their own population about the very nature of that relationship? Can you have the kind of relationship that we had for years with Hosni Mubarak in Egypt or in Pakistan, where we were silent about all of the many things that we did that the Pakistanis said we never would do. And that hypocrisy was exposed by WikiLeaks. That is a good thing that it's exposed, in my view. It's a good thing for probably the people living in those countries, and it's a good thing for us. But going forward, it's going to be I think it's next to impossible to try to do the diplomacy that relied on those secrets and in many ways those lies going forward.
Alexa, your final thoughts?
I think that there will be more Bradley Mannings. I think it's inevitable because of the age that we live in. And I think in a certain way we're going through a type of reformation. It's a reformation for the secular age of information. And we're in the middle of it. And even within the press pool, you can see that reformation and that melding between experience, like the AP guy who's been around forever, and people like me who have just come to this and have been providing sort of asymmetric websites with all the documents for the case. And there's been a kind of an ongoing and developing conversation that we've experienced. And I think that the established press, as well as this newer form of digital journalism or journalism, is happening right now. And it's a very exciting time. It's also a very scary time when we think about the NSA and what the NSA is doing with technology. So we're living in very interesting times.
My thanks to Eli Lake, Adam Klasfeld, Alexa O'Brien. From ReasonTV, I'm Matthew Feeney.